Hello, everybody. Hope you're having a great week. We got 20 photos here. I just a quick note. Zev, I know I've been having you a few weeks in a row. That's because of a clerical error that I missed you for a number of weeks before. So I apologize. I'm trying to catch you up. And Jane, I realized that I had you a few weeks in a row, many weeks in a row, as a clerical error. So that's why you won't see yourself in the screencast for the coming weeks. But without further ado, we also have a new $5 patron. Maybe I'll remember when I get to your photo. Just wanted to welcome you, Keith. Welcome, Keith. All right, so Angie. Also, I feel like Angie, I gotta check your numbers. I feel like you show up pretty often as well. Anywho, interestingly, so I just looked at these photos before I start, and I've noticed already a theme of white balance, and of course, story, exposure as usual. A few of these I'm going to bring up again of my issue with a black background, which I've only recently realized fully, been able to articulate. And just, in general, I think it's sometimes hard to keep the story in mind when we're focused on one particular object, which in this case is a hand. But we'll go into details for each one. I'm going to try and keep the pace that I did last week. I thought that was really good. And you all gave some really positive feedback to that end. So, 2-minute introduction notwithstanding, Angie. So, I personally have issues when you have font, when you have text overlay on the photo itself. The photo should speak for itself. You shouldn't need to have text on the frame. I think it does detract from the photograph. With that said, it did help me to understand at least what you were going for, but I think that the words on the page should speak for itself. So, and I did do a scan, and I didn't see "Thou shalt love thy neighbor," that specific quote here on the page, unless I missed it. But I think it would make more sense and be more powerful to just zoom in on those words, and then maybe you could have a little bit of a close-up of the hand over those words. Perhaps you can light it with a small flashlight, a pen light, or if you were fancy, a flash with a snoot to just show those words, something like that, make it dramatic. You don't need to have the words on the screen. I think that just detracts from the photo. Also, as I will double up on Dan's photo, which I briefly pointed out, is that I think that when you have a complete black background, the subject looks a bit floaty. We don't really have any context of where this is and what it's doing. But if you had a light shining on the backdrop, or in this case, I assume is a table, excuse me, and you could even make it a blue light or an orange light, and you could even make it have some fall off. You could get a little bit fancy with it, but the point is we would get some context as to where this book is, where this hand is, like what is going on. It doesn't need to be that you need to see the entire background or a wall or the house or the room. I'm just saying some light to give it some depth so that it's not just floating in the air. This really dovetails well with my Off the Rails episode that I just recorded today about clarity. And this is, I think, a good example of overly clarified, clear, too clear. Too much of the clarity slider, specifically in this background bokeh, where, as I mentioned Off the Rails, it's meant to be blurred, right? It's meant to not have detail, and then you're forcing the Adobe robot to try and bring out details that aren't there. But besides that, it is a cool image. It's nice, it's gritty. I get the need or the want for some, lovely clarity. But it is, in my opinion, overdone. If I start lowering the clarity, then you're not really going to get the desired effect, because I'm trying to under process an already processed photo. But like I mentioned also in that Off the Rails episode, you do want to take a brush and just subtly, raise clarity, find your spot, bring that in. And I think that would do the trick better than just creating a global clarity slider on the whole image. Also, your focus does appear to be here on his left arm, where I assume the focus should have been over here on the hammer nail. Also, a great trick for anyone that's, hammering nails, and hold a pliers or a vice grip like this. Save yourself some fingers. Okay. Sarah, really good image. I don't really have a critique. If we were having a brainstorming session and I was thinking of a way to perhaps make it, even more interesting or another level, I would have had the shadow maybe interact with something, or have another shadow, or have a person interacting with the shadow. I do also think that the shadow is a little bit soft as compared to your hand. I don't know if I would call that an error, but maybe just something to think about. Really nice photo. Lonnie, so two major issues that stand out for me. One is, okay, it seems that the focus here should be hands working on these greens, right? So the focus, first of all, seems to be over here on the subject's arm. I assume that's not the main subject, so the focus really should have been over here. Similarly, the brightest part of the image is here on the subject's arm, and this is actually rather dark. I could just paint in a little bit of exposure just to see. Let's do this on the inside, raise exposure, and then we'll make another similar one. We'll say on the outside, lower the exposure. Okay, that's a bit extreme, but just to show you for the sake of education, when we look at this, our eye is drawn to where I assume you want the viewer to look, which is this spot right here. If we look at the before and after, the eye actually is drawn over here in all these bright areas. So I'm not saying you want to start playing with brushes in Photoshop. I'm saying you want to look for the light, and you want to position your subject in that light, or if you don't have it, create artificial light like a lamp or a flash, and create that desired contrast so that the viewer's eye will look exactly where you need them to. Leslie, a really nice photo. I assume you were on a photo shoot. Very hard in the moment, but if I were to critique, it is a nice photo, but if I were to critique after the fact, and I word it that way because I feel like I would take the same photo and then see after the fact, oh, actually, we have the little girl here and it's a really cute moment, but we're framed for the couple, and we're a little bit actually too far out for the couple because I assume you wanted to get the girl in, but you're not really getting the girl in, just kind of her head floating there. So in short, you should have taken a step back. I think more of the scene would have captured this little girl, especially getting their feet. That's just a critique of the scene in general. Now, for the challenge at hand, no pun intended, I assume you wanted to focus more on the hands, in which case also not quite close enough. So something I always say, go all the way in, go all the way out, go big or go home. I think in this case, this actually would have been a really poignant photo had we focused very much on the hands. Could have even gotten even tighter, something like that. And I think that says more than this kind of not quite zoomed in, not quite zoomed out framing that you have. Keith, welcome. A really nice photo. I love it. I feel like I would take a photo like this, and we see photos like this with the eyes overlaid on the hands, and that's cool and weird, but not entirely necessary. I think something like this speaks volumes. I do notice you have like a blue-green shadow raise here. I'll just lower the saturation all the way just so you could see. Okay, this is after. This is black and white, and this is how you had it processed, which is fine. I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just pointing it out. I too would probably do that. I like adding a little touch of like blue-green in the shadows, but I don't know. I don't know if it's necessary. The pure black and white is also nice, and that's something that I've come back to in my photographic journey is when shooting black and white. Sometimes I'm just like, hey, just be black and white. Just go pure black and white. There's something nice about that too. Something to keep in mind. No real critique here. Really, really great photo. And like I said, welcome to the club. Dan, I recognized this photo as yours before I looked at the name because it's yellow. I'm not saying right or wrong again. Maybe the clock is yellow, but I'm just saying your photos are always yellow. And maybe you just like yellow subjects. Maybe it's got nothing to do with calibration at all. I'm just telling you what I see. I am going to mirror, no pun intended, the critique that I mentioned for Angie, kind of floating there. And I've seen this with a couple of yours now. I think last week also I gave you the same critique where, give us a backlight. Just shine a light over here, what's going on back there. And again, we don't need to see the room. You can put up a backdrop, even a gray backdrop or a black backdrop, but just shine a light and we could see some context, some depth of where the subject is. Also, I assume hands at the clock. So, I would probably have gone this route, something super close up, just because that's the challenge at hand. I feel like that would have been more appropriate. Very inappropriate, Dan. Very inappropriate. Just joking. Steve, is this miles or kilometers? I guess it's a lot either way. A really fun image. I assume this is blurred in post. I have to assume this is also maybe manipulated in Photoshop, unless you were revving it here at pretty much red line casually with one hand. But ironically, that is my critique, is that we're only seeing one hand. It just actually creates a real imbalance in the photo, especially trying to convey this notion of speed. You really should have had two hands on the wheel. That's not a safety comment. Just visually, I feel like the balance is needed. For me, I feel it a bit askew and imbalanced, just having that casual left hand over there. Also, it does seem a little bit saturated and the blur seems a little bit not so real. If I could think offhand how I would have changed that, I don't know, maybe at night would have been better with like light streaks that I've seen before, going in a tunnel, that kind of vibe. And maybe just generally lowering the saturation would have given it a little bit more of a real feel. Okay, John. Also a bit gritty on the clarity, but I do like it. I don't think it's too crazily overdone, at least for this context. I'm not sure what I would critique here. I was trying to think about it. Perhaps, if it were a normal week, I would say to zoom out. Like I feel like we should see more of the story here. Because going more in, I don't think we'll know what's going on. And it just seems to be cropped. Seems to be like, some kind of wood burning receptacle. What's going on? I think maybe more of the scene would have been better. I understand that you're focusing on the hands. I think you could have given more of the story and perhaps we would have deduced that the hands are what's in play. Roger. Really nice subject. You automatically win, little kitten. The blue shirt is actually quite distracting and something is just generally seems a little bit flat, like this photo needs some contrast. And I say it's distracting, the blue, because, really we should be looking at the cat, I assume, right? So just to play with it, if we were to lower the saturation, once we're in black and white territory, I think we have the liberty of really amping up clarity and the contrast, and suddenly we have like a much more aggressive image that seems more balanced with light and shadow. We're focused solely on the cat, and I think it is more photographically interesting. We look at the before, a lot of blue, it's a bit flat to me, and this to me just looks a bit more dynamic, just something to think about. Alan, one of many that I'm about to go over, white balance. I also am not really sure what the story is. I actually didn't look at your captions this week, but we'll really quickly see what Adobe has to say about the white balance. We'll go to auto and we see right away the temperature is going way down, -50 to the blue, and it's starting to look faded because this is a JPEG. Alternatively, we can go to the saturation sliders and just lower the oranges and yellows manually, to the point where start to see the color drain from the skin, and then you bring it back. And now that looks pretty drained, pretty desaturated, but it does actually look a bit more accurate. We'll look at the before, and we see it's just glowing yellow, which just isn't entirely accurate, I would assume. And again, like I always say, it's probably somewhere in the middle, but I'm just showing you the correction so you can see it. Phyllis, I feel like you had an opportunity here because I see some really nice blue and yellow, some nice contrasting colors here. Perhaps instead of just focusing on the hands, some of you had tunnel vision on the hands, you could have gotten an overhead of actually applying the paint to the paper or having the paint on top of the paper, and then the hands could have been in the frame. That could have been a more interesting play of colors. Nadine, I really like this image, and it's funny because you and I were just discussing last week. You said you had an image like this, so I guess this was a redo. Something about it seems like a little bit flat also, like it needs contrast, but I don't think it needs contrast. I would also think to just play with black and white and see what that looks like, and just, again, adding a little bit of clarity, a little bit of contrast. It's a different image, and it's not necessarily what you're going for, but the before just seems a little bit flat. Maybe it's the color. Maybe if I desaturate it slightly, that looks actually a little bit more natural. Something like that. Yeah, I'm just playing around with it. To me, that looks a little bit better. We'll look at now the before is the black and white. So we have this processing that I just tried, and we have this a bit, more gritty, more contrasty black and white, which I think works with this theme. And then we have your default here. So just food for thought. I think especially if you're going for the skin tone contrast, which is what you and I were discussing, then, perhaps black and white processing does bring that out more, maybe more so than it even is in real life. But I think perhaps it would be more on theme with what you're going for. Okay, Ruth, I'm not entirely sure what's happening here, if I'm being honest. Again, I didn't look at your captions, but I'm not entirely sure what the story is, but that could just be me, which is fine. Also, very yellow, very orange. I want you to start identifying white balance issues. And again, a good way to do it is just go to white balance, go to auto, and see what Adobe has to say. You don't have to agree with the Adobe robot, but at least see, and you can see if you're a little bit off the mark. We see here Adobe really wants this to be more on the blue side. It's going all the way to -49 blue and also away from purple. I do think that doesn't look good. And again, you may want to just go here and try and desaturate, but that doesn't look that great either because I'm just working with a JPEG. But it is, I think, a little bit more realistic. I think I would raise exposure a little bit, contrast. It's starting to be a little bit of something. I'm also not sure what's going on with the background. Is that a post-processing thing? It seems like kind of looks like bokeh, but not really. But then it's also on the table, so it's a little bit visually confusing. This continuous faux bokeh vibe. Let's look at the before here. A little bit dark, very yellow. I think that's what I want to point out is white balance. Zev, a really cool image. It seems like you're on a long shutter, only 1/30. Curious how you did that. I'm going to pause and look at your caption actually. Yeah, so it's interesting. You say it is a composite of about 8 shots. So I just wonder why the blur threw me off. It seems like a long exposure. At least one of your shutters was 1/30. To me, if you're already doing a composite, I would think all the hands could be sharp. All the hands would look nice. I'm looking at the words here. Okay, points off because usually people have like 52 frames reference in the words. But I think this is maybe just more of personal taste. But if all the hands were sharp, do a composite that way. I think that would be a little bit more dynamic. this is cool, but we're not really sure what's going on. We can't really see what's going on with the blur. Audra, also white balance issue, especially when you're shooting outside. I have a photographer friend that teaches portrait photography specifically for like family portraits, for beginners that don't really need as much of, a studio, let's say. And he tells them to go outside, but to avoid the park. It's like the first place that a photographer goes, but you get a lot of green reflection on the skin. If we zoom in, if we just take away the context of what's going on and just look at reflection, straight up what we're seeing, color bounces, right? This is a real thing. And the reflection from the green grass, the green trees, it's going to show up on human skin, especially on the face. And you don't really want somebody's face to look green. They're going to look a bit sickly. So we're not seeing the person's face so much, but you definitely are seeing green in the hands, and your white balance is also a little bit, I would say, on the yellow side. Let's see what the Adobe robot has to say. And you see it pushes it a lot into the purples here, which is the opposite of green. Magenta is the opposite of green, which is trying to color correct. And we're still seeing some green in the hand. So I would then go to HSL and maybe lower the greens, or take a brush and go with some purple here and just kind of start brushing it in. I think it needs a fixing. And, that's starting to look a little bit better, but because it's a JPEG, it's starting to break up a little bit and look a little desaturated. But something to think about, especially when you're in a park. The yellow doesn't help. That's kind of also helping to bring the greens out even more. Carenza, it is a cool image. I think it's just a bit flat. I've seen, your work so much to this point that I'd have to imagine you did this intentionally. And I think it's cool as is. But to make it a little bit more story-like in the technique, I feel like it could be a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more cinematic. It's all flat, right? We're not seeing so much shadow. We're not seeing like a point of light. This to me seems like we should have some kind of ray of yellow sunshine pouring in from the corner, something like that. So, I could try and, edit it a little bit stupidly and just to give you an idea, but let's say this was in shadow, and then we create another brush that was in light and like yellow from up here, and then there was another brush that was like even more yellow from here, just like a pop of sunshine, and I don't know, maybe it was even brighter and make the whole thing a little bit golden. Like, my point is, this looks like a little bit more like a story. lower the exposure, lower the highlights. So I don't know, something like that. I already told you it would be stupid, but my point is not that you should do this, but shoot at sunset. Shoot, identify the light first, and then shoot that way. To me, this looks like it's more of a story, like it's more of a visual story, as opposed to this, which is nice, but it's very flat, right? We're not seeing any shadows. It's just a bit more literal. Steve, really nice photo. I'm very impressed with your outfit changes and your hair changes. This guy, I don't know if I would play poker with this guy on the right. This guy on the left, I think I would play poker. I think I would sooner play poker with him. So Steve in the back, I'm assuming this is you. Steve in the back in the red shirt, a little bit in the shadow. I like that it's natural. I assume that you didn't change the lighting too much, which is realistic, but he is still a bit in the shadow. I would have brought him up a little bit, either in post or just getting a little bit of additional lighting on him. Also, advanced technique. Once you have a setup like this, you could add some lights to the background, even if it's some filler lights or some spots that are just highlighting, the images, the pictures on the wall here, the brick on the wall. start playing around with that. Once you're doing compositing, you could have that as an empty plate, part of your clean plate. And you could even take one flash and shoot one photo with the flash over here and then one over there and start compositing the background. Also, you can create elaborate lighting with just one light once you're in composite land anyways. My other critique is just, I didn't even notice it actually until afterwards that these cards are just kind of floating here. There needs to be, hands. We need to see hands right in front. And in fact, if that were the case, then I think the camera should be lower and perhaps looking up. I only realized afterwards that this is the story over here. And if that's the story, then it should be very much in plain view, much bigger, and hands would bring in some context, and maybe that could be the brightest part of the image. So that's something to think about. Also, a little bit cool. I think if you warmed up the white balance, to me it looks a little bit nicer. But really nice job, very entertaining. Okay, home stretch, Steve. Again, a little bit yellow. An easy fix is just asking Adobe. What do you think, Adobe? We see Adobe brings it down to -11. I would do even further. But it's an indication. You don't have to listen to Adobe, but it's an indication. Also a little bit hot on the skin tone here. We could take a brush and maybe lower the highlights here to see what that looks like. That doesn't look very nice, but it does seem a little bit hot. And actually now that it was lowered in temperature for the white balance, it looked a little bit too blue, the skin. So I actually raised the yellow a little bit in the skin to bring some of that back. And maybe that's the issue. Maybe we're dealing with multiple lights going on here. So I would take a brush if you wanted to fix it and, try and kill the yellows here down there. And then maybe raise some of the yellows elsewhere. Let's see what the heck I did. It didn't end up doing much. But to me, it does seem a little bit of a lack of contrast and a lack of the white balance just being a little bit off. I think that would help the image slightly. And finally, Nathan, just to top it off, again, we'll just go to Adobe. It's a great image, but and I didn't know that it was too blue, although looking at it now, it seems a little bit more obvious now that I know the answer, so to speak. But you go to auto and see what it does, and you're like, oh, yeah, actually, yeah, that looks much more accurate. We start to see the sun on the trees. The skin tones all start to look more natural. If I were to take it a step further, maybe I would create one of these, make everything darker type of thing. So we see, not like this, but just very subtly. So we see our nice bird flipping in the middle. But I don't know. I think it's nice as is. You do naturally have a fall off of light on the sides. Perhaps you could have shot a little bit lower, but then we may not have seen the fingers. Perhaps you could have shot a little bit higher. That could have been interesting as well. And then we could have seen the fingers a little bit more clearly. But that's another hindsight type of vibe. It's not an easy shot to get this, and I think you did it very well and very symmetrical. So again, we'll just look at the before. I want you guys to start identifying white balance. I don't usually critique white balance because generally the white balance in this group is pretty spot on. And it's interesting that this week there were so many that were off, and maybe y'all had tunnel vision on hands. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you so much for all the continued support. That'll wrap it up in under 30 minutes. How about that? I'll see y'all next week. Happy shooting.